Hello and welcome to Outlook Bibliophile. Today marks the 35 years of the 1984 Anti Sikh Riots that had broken out immediately after Prime Minister Indira Gandhi was assassinated by her Sikh bodyguards. We have with us today Radhika Oberoi, who's done a book, her debut novel called Stillborn Season, which is a fictional account of what transpired, what happened as the riots broke out, the fears, the apprehensions of people back then, people who were. It's a fictional account, but you can get glimpses of what people must have felt, those who were directly affected by it, those who were indirectly affected by it. And then there's a other part of the book, the second part of the book, which is more recent in terms of dealing with the reminiscences of that period. It makes for a very interesting reading because there are different kinds of narratives that come into play. It doesn't have a single viewpoint, it doesn't push an agenda, it does not follow only one protagonist as most books do, but has multiple narratives and brings together different viewpoints of the riots. We thought this would be a good discussion to observe the 35 years of that have passed since the riots. Radhika, welcome to Outlook Bibliophile.
Thank you very much.
It's an unusual idea for a debut novel.
Yes.
What made you choose the 84 Sikh Riots, Anti-Sikh Riots to?
Well, it isn't. The book isn't entirely about the 1984 Anti-Sikh Riots. You know, it's a story of this little girl called Amrit who grows up in a neighborhood which is relatively peaceful,
Right.
and then the peace of her childhood is broken by this riot that creeps in suddenly, you know. So the book begins by capturing a lot of childhood snapshots of children playing in parks and of old people walking around, and a very peaceful colony that is suddenly there's news that the Prime Minister has been assassinated, and and absolute chaos breaks out in the city. And the second half is of course about Amrit growing up and becoming a reporter herself, and then deciding to investigate what happens. And by then a lot of very seasoned reporters have already reported on the 84 riots, and she feels that her stories perhaps may not resonate with the kind of reality that she hopes for. But she it captures her despair, and it captures the fact that there is no one truth. No one truth emerges, hence the multiple perspectives
Narratives.
and hence the multiple narratives.
A challenge, particularly dealing with something like this, and something that's also part of our history, is that one often tends to follow a particular narrative, a particular propaganda, or a particular viewpoint.
Right.
In that sense, your book is different because it deals with various people, a person, a beggar,
Yes.
a taxi driver. It deals with, as you mentioned, Amrit, who grows up, who's a survivor of the riots in a way, and then grows up to be a journalist. And so multiple narratives.
Yes.
Was it a conscious decision to treat the book that way, or is it something that, while you were researching for it, you thought that this was a better approach?
Yeah, well, one starts off by imagining a linear narrative, but as one begins to write, and as one begins to research, you begin to understand that all narratives around the riot are unpredictable and are unreliable.
Right.
Hence the need to get multiple perspectives. So there is this one chapter called Rioter, which is actually a sympathetic view of the kind of people who were recruited to sort of during the riots, and he was actually someone who was clueless about who the Prime Minister of the country is and why she was assassinated, and he just sort of wanted his daily meal. He just wanted to sort of sleep on a full stomach that particular night, and that's why he
used
decides.
the riots as
use the
a means to earn his
absolutely.
Right.
Hence, I mean, it does not sympathize obviously with the rioters or with those who perpetrated the violence, but it tries to delve into realities from all sides. Hence, you have these stories which actually work independently as well, and then are stitched together to form this one fictive universe, of course.
Right. Now, what I particularly like about this book is the way it ends. There's a kind of fictional interview, naturally, that she ends the book with, where Amrit, one of the protagonists of the book, is interviewing the Prime Minister, the dead Prime Minister. How did that idea come about?
Well, I spent a lot of time at Indira Gandhi's memorial on Safdarjung Road, and I actually stood around staring at those artifacts, and it really humanizes the Prime Minister. You get a view into her life, you get to see her bedroom, her dining room, and there are these little plaques that explain how she invited guests, the kind of guests that were there. And so I decided to use that to create this stream of consciousness, if you like. If you want to call it that, you could, but it is an absolutely imaginary account of a journalist standing within those lawns, imagining what would have happened had the dead Prime Minister been alive, and what would that interview have sounded like. And this is something that when we launched the book, we did a dramatized reading of it, and Sonam Kalra actually dramatized the dead Prime Minister with a lot of she was extremely passionate, and sort of, it was an absolutely beautiful reading in that sense.
Right.
I'd also like to point out that the prologue begins. So the book begins and ends with a garden. So the prologue begins with Peter Ustinov actually waiting
for the interview, for the appointment.
For the appointment, and then he hears these shots ringing out, and it is, of course, just before Diwali, and so somebody says it's firecrackers, but it isn't, and it ends with an incomplete interview. The prologue ends there, and then the epilogue ends with an imaginary interview between a journalist and the dead Prime Minister.
Now, it's been 35 years, as we keep mentioning, since the riots. This is one of the accounts that, this is a fictional account, but based on the riots. Multiple books, research material, everything's come out on the riots. But people who are directly affected by the riots, and I believe you spent a lot of time, 4 years, researching the book, and you met a lot of these people who were directly hit by the riots. You researched with widows, and there is no sense of closure in this case. What is it that struck you the most when you met the survivors, the people who were affected by the riots?
Well, there's a lot of apathy to begin with, and there's a lot of cynicism if you're walking around, as a journalist with a little notepad or a camera, and you want to sort of interview them. They don't treat you very well. I mean, they don't welcome you into their homes, and they don't say that, come, let me tell you my sob stories, because so many years have gone by, and it does seem to be this endless struggle for justice. And we've seen in the recent past that things have reached some sort of conclusion in terms of what has happened recently, but when you speak with them, you understand that their lives have been extremely difficult for the past 35 years. Their children have grown up without fathers. They are mostly derelict, or they sort of turn to drug addiction and alcohol, and you can see empty bottles lying around. Several governments have come and promised all kinds of things, but done nothing. So they live in these little matchbox-sized apartments in Tilak Vihar, which are riddled with all sorts of problems. And of course, I wanted to capture all of that with a lot of empathy and humor, which I hope I've done, because there's this one character called Nirmal Kaur who wants to send this journalist off, and she says that if she wants to hear a sob story, I could fake a few tears and show her my scars and say that this is what happened, but she prefers not to do that.
Now, there's the other thing with not just the the 84 riots, but any riots or any kind of a social churning is we tend to focus while writing on the disaster, the carnage, the pogrom, what very few people deal with is how, while all of this is going on, there's also the society which is removed from the politics of the entire episode, and how people, irrespective of their religion, their social strata, come together in these trying times. And that is something that this book captures, the people at large. Radhika, what was the motivation for, or the trigger? Because for your book, the sense that I got while reading it was that the central character is not one or two different people, but it's largely
a community.
Yeah. What made you, approach it in that manner?
Well, the fact that it was a community that was impacted, but then there was, the Sikh community was impacted, but there were Hindus and Muslims that came together to protect their Sikh brethren. And that is captured in a chapter titled Tenants. In Tenants, there's this young couple that live in a barsati of this huge house, and there's and the husband is a young Sikh boy who decides to go for a jog every morning in his vest and in his shorts, and he is told that the riots are going on, that you should stay indoors or cut your hair, and he refuses to do that. And then eventually, when sort of the action picks up, they are rescued by their Hindu neighbors, and they seek shelter in one of the homes within that very neighborhood. So a lot of it is also inspired by my own childhood, because we grew up, where I grew up, it was rather safe, but there was a lot of news that was filtering in, and so as I mentioned, that the riot creeps into this utopian world that children create for themselves, and so there are memories of adults talking in hushed tones, birthday parties that are cancelled, so schools that are closed, and hence I've tried to capture that. So the first half really is about a childhood that is interrupted by a riot. There's this one story called The Novice, which is really about a convent school that reopens after a few weeks of rioting, and yeah.
Thanks, Radhika, a lot for your time. Do catch a copy of this book, and I'm sure you'll enjoy reading this. Thank you.